Welcome to the Weekly Leadership Experience, a place for leaders to get inspired, be challenged, and grow. I am your host, Reshad Oberlander. Let's get started. Today's episode of the Weekly Leadership Experience is brought to you by my 7-day Leadership Growth Challenge. It's a free challenge that I've created, and it's delivered by email over the course of 7 days. I've created 7 compelling questions to challenge various aspects of your leadership, the way you lead, and why you lead. Go to reshadoberlander.com and scroll down until you find the 7-day leadership challenge, or look for the link in the show notes. And now, on with the show. Well, hello leaders, and welcome to this week's show. I'm glad you've joined me today, and today I thought we'd do something a little different, and I wanted to share with you a podcast where I was the guest, and I was interviewed not too long ago on the Thoughtful Leader podcast with Ben Brearley, and we talked about my experiences and my thoughts on building resilience, overcoming toxicity in the workplace, and bouncing back from difficult situations, which I think a lot of people can relate to and can, find some connection to that. It's an ongoing and common thing, I think, to find yourself in situations that are difficult, and how do you kind of withstand and resist, and also how do you move on from that. So it's a really important conversation. Make sure you check out Ben and the Thoughtful Leader podcast. The links are in the show notes. We'll talk to you again soon. In the meantime, stay awesome.
Welcome to the Thoughtful Leader podcast. My name is Ben Brearley. I'm a leadership coach and the founder of Thoughtful Leader. The Thoughtful Leader podcast is all about short, sharp leadership advice, because thoughtful leadership is good leadership. Welcome to episode 127 of the Thoughtful Leader podcast. You might have noticed today's episode is a little bit longer because we have a special interview with Reshad Oberlander, who is an experienced leader and hosts the Weekly Leadership Experience podcast. Now, the focus of this episode is about resilience and bouncing back from toxic workplaces and toxic bosses, something we can all probably relate to. Reshad shares some of his wisdom on this podcast interview. It's a really good one. Reshad is a leadership super junkie with more than 17 years of award-winning leadership experience in a number of industries. He hosts the podcast The Weekly Leadership Experience, where he shares content designed to challenge, inspire, and grow your leadership. Reshad wants to help leaders grow themselves and their teams to be more effective and avoid the mistakes in leadership that he has made or seen. Reshad is also a Canamera Australian, which, for those who are not familiar with that term, that means he's lived in or grown up in Canada, America, and Australia. So he's got a great affinity with all of those countries, which is pretty awesome. But he currently lives in Edmonton, Alberta, with his wife, 2 daughters, and Zeus, the Weimaraner. Now, as you can see from that introduction, I've got a lot in common with Reshad, being passionate about leadership and helping leaders improve. So it's going to be a good one. Without further ado, I will get into the interview. Let's go. Okay, thanks for joining us, Reshad. It's great to have you here on the Thoughtful Leader podcast.
Yeah, my pleasure, man. Just good to catch up with you and chat.
Yeah, definitely. And I obviously came across you for the first time when I listened to some of your Weekly Leadership Experience podcast episodes, which is really cool. You've got a really wide array of guests on there. So I want to talk to you a bit about that later on as well, like what prompted you to do that. But I guess just to get started, it'd be good for you to give a little bit of a background on your leadership experience and what you've been doing, various roles you've been taking on over the past, over your career, just so the listeners get a bit of an idea about your background.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and again, thanks for having me on, Ben. And as you mentioned, the podcast of mine, the Weekly Leadership Experience, which I've been fortunate to have you on as well. So thank you for that. I've always found myself tending to gravitate towards positions either of leadership or, leadership type positions. And I say leadership type positions, like somewhere where I might be teaching someone something that I know, right? Or I've learned something and I'm sharing that information. I'm the oldest of four boys. So by default, that comes with some leadership quality where you're, taking responsibility for your younger siblings and that kind of thing. So I tended towards that anyway.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
but I've always said, and other people would say the same, is that, leaders are not born, they're made, but some people are inherent with certain leadership, predicators, right? And I think that I had a few of those, so I've tended towards those things. A lot of my leadership and career experience has been in retail. So I've had a diverse experience in retail, from selling cell phones to commodity goods to luxury goods to automotive. So quite a bit of different experiences, and each one of those little segments of retail has its own challenges. So I've managed in all of those areas and led at different levels, mostly frontline leadership. Yeah, that's sort of where I've been over my career.
Yeah, retail is an interesting space. There'll be lots of different challenges there, especially frontline leadership, I imagine.
Definitely, there's some unique challenges to that environment for sure.
Yeah, well, we'll probably get into some of those later, I reckon. So, but before we get started on the topic today, which is about resilience, we'll go into that in a little bit. I'm interested though, what prompted you to create your weekly leadership experience podcast? And I'll put some links to those things in the show notes so listeners can check them out as well. But yeah, what was behind that? What made you do that?
Yeah, I've always had a passion and a love for leadership. I was exposed at a young age. My mom, a lot of credit to her, because she homeschooled myself and my brothers for quite a long time, and a lot of it was self-directed, but it was also intelligently directed. I'll say, she encouraged us to read a lot and to have a diverse range of interests, and she always put books in my hands by the likes of Dale Carnegie and Og Mandino and John Maxwell, which stimulated the interest, I think, in leadership to begin with. And then it kind of carried on. It really took hold. So I've always been passionate about it. I've always found it very interesting. And I wanted to begin to share my passion for leadership with others. And I also wanted to, build a resource and myself as a resource that would help other people who want to be leaders or who are leaders, either overcome something that they're facing or just provide some inspiration and some kind of a trigger for growth. So that was sort of the motivation for me starting my podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome. And I'm sure many leaders out there are thanking you for that. I think you just had your first year anniversary. I saw that with the podcast. So
Yeah, that's
congratulations
right.
on that.
Thank you.
That's cool. But let's move on to the topic today, which was about resilience. So when we last talked, you mentioned that, you've got an interest or, some experience in bouncing back from setbacks and then going through some toxic workplace environments as well. And I myself have been in some toxic workplaces, and I would hazard a guess that most people listening have probably been in what they consider to be a toxic workplace at one time or another. So can you tell us about, just start off by telling us about some experiences you've had in your career that you've needed to recover from, let's say?
Yeah, for sure. I think that, I'll qualify it by saying that nearly everything that you come across in life is going to impact you one way or another, whether it's positively or negatively, and how you respond to those experiences builds or diminishes resilience, I suppose, in some way or fashion. So, there's been lots in life in general that is, there's been some negative aspect to, and that has built my character one way or another. But in terms of building resilience is, I consider, a character trait, right? And it's something that you have to sort of choose to build. Like it's not something that just builds by itself, unless you're really, really predicated towards, that kind of a mindset to begin with. I think that people have to choose to want to get over something, they have to choose to learn from something. They have to choose to not let a situation or circumstance get the better of them, and actually, allow that to take root. And then they face that situation or some kind of a similar situation down the road, and then they can look back on that and go, oh, I've faced this before. So sorry, that kind of diverged from your question a little bit, but a couple of experiences that I've had. One sort of earlier in my career was a very sales heavy environment, and I was working in a retail storefront with a few other salespeople, and the two in particular salespeople in this environment were just very aggressive types. And I don't mean physically or anything like that, but they were, leading the charge to get to the customer. They were jumping on them. They were pushy. They were, those kind of things. And it was very difficult to have any breathing space as a newer salesperson, and new to the industry too. It was difficult to find space in there, and it was largely kind of glanced over by management because they produced so much, right? Both of these salespeople were quite successful, but it was difficult to really be able to kind of step up and create a space for myself in that situation. So they also, kind of were pushy and just kind of ran right over you if you got in their way, kind of thing. So it was that type of an environment. I wouldn't say that they were awful people, but they had some toxic qualities, right? Mm-hmm. Something that was more later on in my career was working with a supervisor who was extremely overbearing, and ultimately just largely downright mean. There was a number of circumstances that I had with the person that was hurtful, was very difficult to deal with, and had an impact on my personal life. It led to depression and anxiety, and it was a lot of situational stuff, I guess, related to that workplace. But it was certainly the toughest experience I've faced as both a leader and as an employee in a business, working for someone that was so rude and difficult to work with. And it took a good couple of years for me to recover, I would say, fully from that. And maybe I think there's even still a few elements still years later that there can be little trigger points, that come up.
Yep. Absolutely. So yeah, thanks for sharing that stuff. I know that's pretty tough to recall and recollect, I guess. Mm-hmm. One thing that stands out from the sales example you talked about was the fact that these guys, I assume they were guys, that maybe that's a bad assumption, is they were getting good results, like good sales figures, and therefore they were sort of untouchable. Is that sort of how you saw it as well? So they would take the bad behavior because they got such good results.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of times we overlook bad behavior because someone is really good at their job. It doesn't have to be sales. They could be the best mechanic. They could be the best carpenter. They could be the best salesperson or the best driver. Like, there's anything, but, and then everything is kind of overlooked because they're the best at it.
Yeah, for sure. And I've seen that myself. And that's the thing that always comes to my mind is, okay, what are the side effects of that are happening in the workplace that we're not measuring, which is all the stuff that you're talking about, I think, which is, you go home and it affects your home life and all those sorts of things. It's not just about work. Out of these experiences that you've had, what do you think were some of the key factors that made this, let's call them toxic workplaces, but made it sort of a bad work environment to be in?
Well, I think, Ben, if I'm understanding your question, is sort of like what leads to toxic environments. And I think that it's there's a few things that I think of when I think of what causes toxic environments. And I think that these factors ultimately relate to a broad array of issues, not just toxic workplaces, but obviously toxic workplaces is a really big issue in the business world. But there's a few main areas. There's four things that I'd like to highlight. The first three are very closely related, and the fourth one is a little bit less so. But the first three are how we recruit, how we develop, and how we promote people. I think is some key ingredients in what contributes to toxic workplaces. And if we pause on that for a moment and think of what a toxic workplace looks like, it might be different from person to person, but generally I think that we can agree that there's some commonalities in what we think of in terms of toxic workplaces. Probably overbearing or micromanaging type boss. Perhaps some people that are in the colleague level that are difficult to work with because they're either just an obnoxious individual, they have some behavior that's overlooked, or maybe they're one of those top performer types that because they produce so much, they think they can get away with murder. So I think those are some commonalities in toxic workplace. Other things could be, it's a just a negative environment. Everybody's negative. Everyone's complaining. Those kind of things, right? But in terms of the three factors I just mentioned, recruitment, development, and promotion, a lot of times it kind of comes back to that idea of we're recruiting and we're looking for the person who already has a great track record of, top sales or top performance or really admirable achievements. And we glaze over the fact that they were late for the interview, that they were kind of a bit rude, or their references weren't fantastic. Like there's these warning lights that are coming up, and we're kind of like starstruck by the fact that they have all these amazing achievements, right? And so we're not looking enough at a person's attitude, and we're looking entirely at their ability, right? So ability is something that can be taught. I can teach you, Ben, to sell better, right? I can teach you how to sell this or that. I can teach you skills. I can teach you methods of how to be a better salesperson. I can teach someone how to be a better mechanic. I can teach someone, like, I'm not a mechanic. I'm just saying, like, someone can be taught these things, right? What I can't teach you, unless you're willing to be coached, right, is how to improve your attitude, right? And so if someone comes in with a lousy attitude, they've been recruited to do a job, that attitude is going to be crappy straight off the bat. So we've already put someone in place who's going to bring an element of toxicity to it. Then they are developed, and either they're developed because, again, they're a top performer and they're getting all these other opportunities because they're a top performer, and sales hides all sins, right? Or we're not developing people. And I think both ends of that spectrum are, again, elements that are contributing to toxicity, because we're not really causing growth opportunity. We're just allowing things to stagnate in a lot of cases when it comes to our people. And then promotion, I think a lot of times is like it's the person that's there, not the person that should get the job, right? Or it's the person that's been there the longest, or it's the person that's the best at it, or something like that. And I was listening to a great podcast the other day that was talking about a different subject, but this sort of issue came up of how we sort of promote people. And like a lot of times the only path to growth for a great salesperson is to become the sales manager, or the only path for a good mechanic to make more money and to advance in the company is to become the lead tech, or whatever the case is. And it's like, these vertical paths of growth opportunity are so limited to, you're a salesperson, then you're the sales manager, and that's the only way you can earn more money or gain any kind of recognition. And, rather than, what other opportunities could we create where people can still grow with the company, increase their earning potential, but they never actually have to become a manager? Maybe they're not even interested in managing or leading people. Maybe they just are wanting that little bit of recognition or opportunity for growth. But, they're now in a position, they've been promoted because that's the only path that they see. They don't actually want to have anything to do with managing people. And that, and then they, by virtue of just having been put in the position, they don't want to be there. Now they're a horrible boss, right? So those are the three that I think are closely tied together. The last one is, what do we tolerate? And this is, I think, sort of an overarching issue. I think if you look at kind of across all the things I've just mentioned, what do we tolerate? This person is rude and ignorant to their colleague, and you saw it happen, but you do nothing about it. So you've tolerated that. Now it becomes a precedent, and other people know that they can get away with it because you'll say nothing. Or so-and-so is a great salesperson and they just closed a really big deal, and then they did something really horrible, but we overlook it because they've just closed a big deal and made us a lot of money. And so there's all these things that we tolerate. And we tolerate people talking down to one another, and we tolerate, the gossip, and we tolerate the little bullying and the microaggressions that are going on in the workplace because either we're too lazy, we don't know what to do, we don't have any training on what to do, we don't know who to turn to, whatever the issues are, but those all become levels of tolerance. And what you tolerate will propagate. It'll continue to grow, and it'll grow and it'll grow and become this toxic environment that we're discussing. So those are the factors that I think of and see.
That's awesome. So that's like covers the full life cycle, really, from someone getting into the organization to going up in the ranks. And I've seen that a lot myself with, the best engineer becomes the engineering manager, for example, something like that. And, they might not, and obviously the skills required to be an engineering manager are way different than being the best engineer in a technical capacity in that example. Yeah, that's really good. I love that point about tolerance as well. What do you say? What we tolerate propagates. That's a cool catchphrase right there. I mean, I see a lot of those factors in many workplaces. So, I mean, just to touch on that then, because just to go into that a bit, what do you think leaders can do to set up an environment where we start to pay attention to what we're tolerating and try to cut down on that, like to set clear boundaries where we go, you know what, we're not going to tolerate this behavior. Do you have any tips on that?
Yeah, I think that it's there's no real silver bullet. One of the things I think leaders maybe at some point face it in all careers, and it's some leaders will face it well and some leaders won't. But you're going to be wrong, and you got to be able to admit when you're wrong, and you got to be able to be called out. And when you notice that something's taking place and you don't do something about it, if you don't have the emotional intelligence to realize that, we're going to have some challenges, right? Because the little voice in your head, or the little angel on your shoulder, whatever euphemism you want to use, probably just poked you when that happened and goes, that wasn't right. And you either have to decide to respond or not, right? And you have to live with that on your conscience. All right. And I mean, there can be little things, or there can be much bigger issues that come up, and they're all an opportunity to respond or not. There's a really cool book that I read called, I think it's called The No Asshole Rule. Mm-hmm. And it's a really honest and kind of a raw look at a lot of the issues of these people in the workplace who are jerks, right? And it can be rather subtle things, and it can be very overt things, and you sort of have to make a decision. You have to make a choice that you're not going to tolerate jerks in your workplace, or life for that matter. You don't have to tolerate, your neighbor or your family member or whoever the case is being a jerk. You can choose not to allow it. You can choose to remove said person from your workplace. You can choose to not communicate with those people outside of work. And I think that that's probably the biggest thing that you can do, is make a choice that you're not going to continue to allow bad behavior. And you're not going to, and it doesn't matter how good of a producer that person is. And sometimes you have to look to it yourself and go, oh, I'm the jerk, right? And I've been the jerk and had to face dealing with that, like having made bad decisions with my team and then been a bad example, or said something that I shouldn't have said, or offended someone, or whatever the case is. And like you have to make a choice that you're going to stop being the jerk, that you're not going to allow jerks in the workplace, and you're not going to allow jerks in your life. I think really, if there was going to be a starting point, that's it.
Yeah. And yeah, I've been the jerk, or the dickhead, as we call it in Australia, as well. And yeah, that interesting, the no arsehole rule. That I'll try to get a link to that, put it in the show notes as well. I think in Australian sporting teams, there's a lot of no dickhead policy going around, where people say that's what they want. They don't want their sporting teams to have dickheads in there. So yeah, it's a similar concept. That's pretty powerful though. So it's really, it's that choice, and making that conscious choice, which I think is important. And I think even if you make a choice that you consciously make a choice that you're not going to do anything, that's pretty powerful as well, because at least you're not sitting on the boundary and umming and ahhing. You're going, you know what, that's my call in this situation. I'm going with it. So yeah, it's interesting. And I think one of the hardest things I've seen in the workplace is where people toe that line between inappropriate or appropriate behavior, where it's sort of borderline, it's not really obvious. And they're the trickiest ones I've found to tackle. But no, that's really good. Thank you for that. And going back to that topic of resilience again, in terms of some of the challenges you've had in the workplace, what do you think were the most important factors for you in being able to bounce back and come back from those challenges?
Yeah, I think like one of the things that, like I said earlier, and I've talked about in my own podcast, is life is full of experience, good, bad, and otherwise. And it all has a degree of influence over who you are today. And how you respond to some of those things can definitely set you up to be more resilient, or to be, quote unquote, a victim. Resilience is definitely, in my view, a choice to learn something from a situation, and sort of integrate that into your life DNA. And when you face something like that in the future, you're able to face it better, right? But you have to choose, I think, to want to learn something from it. You can't just choose to, which is part of my healing process. That bad experience I talked about, right? It took me a couple of years. And, some of the things that would go on for me would be like, I'd be replaying and replaying and replaying conversations with that person in my mind. And what would I say to that person if I saw them on the street? And, tell them of all the wrong things they did to me and all this other stuff. And it's like, at some point you have to be like, okay, this isn't helping, this isn't benefiting, right? And choose to let go of some of that and heal from some of that and move on. And one of the things that you do potentially need to do, depending on the circumstances that you faced, is get outside assistance, whether that's a coach or a counselor or a psychologist, or just someone who's a really good listener. But like sometimes you actually have to get some of that off your chest in order to help release some of that energy, right? To be more resilient, you have to decide to learn from it. And like, as an example, like if that was the last tough experience I've had in a workplace, that would be fantastic. But that wasn't the last tough experience I've ever had in a workplace. But I can tell you that the next tough experience I had in a workplace wasn't so hard on me. It didn't drive me to the brink of depression. It didn't, ruin things for me like that our earlier experience had, because I've been through it. I've weathered it. I've survived. I've learned. I've evolved, and I've grown.
And when you when you made that choice, you said you got to make a choice to grow from it, like to learn from it, right? And what for you personally, what made you make that choice?
I think it was just realizing how much energy I was spending on kind of reliving those negative moments with that person or with other people who've maybe been negative towards me in the past. It's like, oh, I wish
Mm.
I'd said that to so and so. Like I had a really good comeback, but it was 10 minutes too late, right? And I
Yep.
was like, well, yeah, but like, of what benefit is it to you? Like, what is it? What does it matter? And what, even if you had that comeback in that moment, like, what does it do? Are you going to feel good that you just made that other person feel really bad?
Mm.
Like, does it make you feel better? It doesn't. And I mean, I was spending a crazy amount of time. Like, I would dream about it. I would think about it. I would talk with some of my close friends about it. And some of those friends were people that worked in the same company, so they were somewhat more intimate with what had gone on. And we'd talk about it, and we'd kind of rehash it and be like, "Oh, that person's a jerk," and "Oh, that person this," and "Oh, that person that." And if I saw that person, I'd do this and that and the other thing. And it's like you're spending all this energy, and it's not constructive. And there was just a point at which I came to, and I was like, "Wow, I've just I've just spent 45 minutes talking about this again, and it's not helping. It's not getting me any more ahead."
Mm.
Um, so I suppose it wasn't any one particular event, but it was just realizing the amount of time I was wasting
Mm.
continuing to dwell on it
Yep.
and having to choose. You know what? All right, it was really bad. It was very tough. It's not something I'd ever want to go through again. These are some of the things that I was able to learn from it. This is my role in what happened, and here's some forgiveness for me, and here's some forgiveness for that other person.
Mm.
Not that that other person may ever know that I did forgive them, but that's part of what I see as a healing journey.
Yeah. No, that's pretty powerful, and also knowing, like looking at your own role in the situation as well, I think is important for growth as well. Because then the next time you can try to minimize those things that you might do to contribute to these situations.
Hmm.
Yeah, because that's within your control, obviously, which is cool.
Yeah.
You touched a bit on the mental health side of things. So obviously, mental health is a massive concern, in society as a whole, in every country, and in workplaces. Obviously, we spend so much of our time at work. It's natural that it's going to come into the workplace. And I'm interested in, as a leader, do you have any experience leading people that have had some challenges in this area, and what sort of ways do you help look out for that and observe that, and how do you tackle it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know who is famously quoted for saying it, but everybody has issues and everybody needs therapy,
Mm.
like to one degree or another. So, it mental health is such a huge field, and a big conversation. But I think that there's obviously more and more being done around it. Um, I think one of the best things what people can do for each other is be open to the conversation. Um, and like for me, I always dealt. I've always had any team I've managed. There's always been at least one person who's got something going on, whether it was ADD, ADHD, bipolar, like drug and alcohol, like all kinds of stuff. Um, and even in my own family, I've faced some of that, and myself personally with some depression, anxiety. It became a lot easier to be empathetic towards people struggling with mental health once I'd had a personal run-in with it,
Mm.
because you learn a lot about whether it's depression or anxiety, or like you learn about how the brain makes connections between different points and triggers, and like addictions and all that kind of stuff. Kind of you gain a better understanding of it when you've dealt with it personally. I'm not suggesting anyone should go out and get themselves a mental health challenge, But if you've ever struggled with it, you should be more empathetic towards people who are struggling with it. It's a tricky area because you can't fix people as a leader. Like you can't, and you're not responsible to. I think that we have a responsibility to care for and aid, and if we have resources available, certainly direct people towards them. But a lot of times people have to make a choice for themselves too, that they're going to take advantage of those resources or listen to some advice, or reach out to the hand that's reaching towards them, right? You can't, unfortunately, fix people for them.
Yeah.
But we can certainly be on the lookout for it. And if people are acting weird, and or if people come to you and suggest it, or or if someone says something about someone else and it's got some weight to it, it's worth taking seriously enough to at least look into and ask some questions.
Yeah, for sure. No, thanks for sharing that. That's I can sort of understand a little bit about when I moved to over Easter. When I was living in Sydney a few years ago, I had a bit of anxiety come on from some being homesick and all that sort of stuff. So I definitely had a bit of a tough time there, which I do use in my leadership and I recall that when I'm working with people that have had those challenges as well. So yeah, it's definitely that's a really good point about building that empathy or having that empathy. And I think we'll wrap up now. I think you've covered so many good things. We've touched a whole load of different topics, and obviously mental health is one we can talk about for hours. But I sort of want to close with asking what does thoughtful leadership mean to you? And obviously that's the name of the podcast, but I'm interested in your take on that.
Yeah, I consider myself a thoughtful person, and I was challenged on that briefly by Gary Vaynerchuk. When early in the COVID pandemic, he started a video series that was kind of simulcast on YouTube and a bunch of other social media platforms, and it was called Tea with Gary V. And you could basically get yourself on the show by submitting a question to his team, or someone would kind of see your question and tag you for getting on the show. So I was able to get on the show with a question I wanted to ask him about leadership. So I can't remember the question I asked him, but during I think it was 5-6 minutes that we talked, I said something about how I spend a lot of time sometimes just thinking and overthinking because I'm a thoughtful person. And he's like, okay, be thoughtful by nature, not by design. Mm-hmm. Which I think is a cool distinction because, when you put anything on a pedestal, you kind of idolize it and it becomes almost a weakness. So I choose to be thoughtful by nature and less by design, and just allow my thoughtfulness to come through on its own, I guess. But I think to summarize, I would say that being a thoughtful leader to me just means being conscious and engaged.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And I've seen some of Gary V's episodes on that. And so, yeah, that's interesting. I'll try to check that one out. I'll see if I can get the link to that in the show notes as well.
You got some work ahead of you. Goodness.
So yeah, just to thank you very much once again for coming on, Reshad. It's been really good listening to your experiences and some of the wisdom that you've imparted there, which is really awesome.
My pleasure.
But where can listeners learn more about you and find you? Where's the best place? And we'll put some links in the show notes as well to these places.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks for having me on, Ben. It's been a great time talking with you again. My website is reshadoberlander.com. You can read about me there and tune into all my podcast episodes on the weekly leadership experience. And then if you want to find me on social media, I am R.E. Oberlander on pretty much all the platforms.
And he does have some awesome guests on his show, so check them out. I'm not talking about myself. I was on there, but he's got some much more high-profile ones. So make sure you listen to those episodes.
Everybody's got something to teach, Ben.
All right. Yeah, thanks again, Reshad. I appreciate it. And take care of yourself.
I will. Thank you very much.
So there you have it. That was an interview with Reshad Oberlander. I hope you got a lot of interesting information out of that one. I certainly enjoyed the conversation. If you want to find out more about Reshad and listen to his weekly Leadership Experience podcast, which I highly recommend, go to the show notes page at thoughtfulleader.com/127. Thank you once again for listening, and keep up the thoughtful leadership as usual, and I'll be back next week.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, would you head over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts and subscribe, leave me a rating, leave me a review, and share this with a friend. It spreads the word and helps the podcast grow. You can also find me on social media at R.E. Oberlander. Until next time, stay awesome.